This is a prison without walls. Even if a prisoner is seen escaping, the guards won't do anything because the area outside the prison is filled with landmines. As long as the escapee dares to run into the minefield, they will be instantly obliterated. Not long ago, the groom-to-be Stu brought his friends to South America for a bucks party. After the event, the group arrived at the airport ready to head home, but Stu never expected his friend Ryan to have slipped a small bag of contraband into his pocket, successfully evading airport security. His actions made everyone nervous, but just as they were starting to breathe easy, another friend of Stu's ran into trouble. Greg clutched his stomach, collapsed on the ground, convulsed, and foamed at the mouth. The nearby drug-sniffing dog started barking uncontrollably. The group was then taken to an interrogation room and told that Greg had swallowed a balloon filled with contraband for smuggling purposes. The balloon had burst, causing him to suffer from poisoning. A few police officers then barged in, forcibly restrained the group, and soon they were taken to a small island controlled entirely by the military and police. Upon arriving at the island, Stu saw several bags containing corpses being unloaded. Though he wasn't sure what was going on, his instincts told him this place was far from ordinary. The group was pushed onto a truck, and after a rough ride, they finally arrived at their destination, a national prison in the center of the island. After getting off the truck, Stu's father-in-law, John, was puzzled by the sight. A prison without even a wall. Did the guards not fear prisoners escaping? As they were wondering, a prisoner sprinted out of the prison at full speed. A guard in the tower raised his gun, ready to shoot, but another guard immediately lowered it. Stu and the others watched as the prisoner attempted to escape, but before he got far, he stepped on a landmine. With an explosion, the escaping prisoner was instantly obliterated. It turned out the prison was surrounded by landmines, and no one could ever escape alive. That was the reason the prison had no walls. Seeing this, John realized they needed to leave quickly. He and his son, Kai, decided to find the prison's warden and ask for consular help as British citizens. Meanwhile, Greg's stomach wound was bleeding and he needed urgent medical attention. Stu took his two friends to find a doctor here. So, the two groups split up. John and his son arrived at the office door. After knocking, he told the guard that he wanted to meet the warden. The guard let them enter the office, but to their surprise, the large office only had this one guard. The guard pressed a button on the desk, and a door immediately opened. At that moment, John heard someone speaking from inside the room. Following the voice, they entered the room, but what they found was a computer on the desk. The person on the screen was the warden they wanted to meet. John explained that they were British citizens and had nothing to do with the smuggling of contraband. The warden told him that they would need to go through the court system here. Before the verdict, they would remain imprisoned at this facility. And when John asked how long the ruling would take, the warden replied, 5 to 6 years. After saying this, the signal was lost, and the screen went black. Meanwhile, Stu and his friends found the doctor, but due to the language barrier, the doctor had no idea what they were trying to say. The doctor then raised his gun, causing them to raise their hands in fear. The doctor opened the curtain behind him to reveal a man, bound and soaking in ice water. The man, who spoke fluent English, pleaded for help as they stood frozen, not understanding why the man was in the ice water. The doctor pointed the gun at them again. At that moment, a man picked up a chair and smashed it over the doctor's head, knocking him unconscious. Seeing this, the man asked them to quickly release him. Stu and the others, still not understanding, cut the ropes binding the man. Once free, the man leaped out of the tub, grabbed the gun on the floor, opened the door, and ran out naked. At the same time, two women in nurse uniforms arrived with a stretcher, lifting Greg and heading into the prison. On the way, they crossed paths with the two groups. John thought this was a sign of preferential treatment. They arrived at a heavily guarded courtyard, where the prison's manager, Selma, greeted them. She had heard that Greg was a millionaire, but upon learning he had been imprisoned for smuggling, her demeanor immediately changed. She demanded $200,000 from them. If they couldn't provide the money, they would be sent back to the UK in pieces. After saying this, she ordered her men to throw them out of the gate. As they stepped outside, a stranger handed them a fax. Kai opened the fax and saw that it was from the embassy, informing them that the British embassy was aware of their situation. Even so, they would face 100 years in prison. While everyone was frustrated by this, John thought it was a good thing. At least the embassy knew where they were. The 100-year sentence was probably just a fabricated story. He believed that someone would eventually come to rescue them. At that moment, the stranger told them that the embassy had already arranged a cell for them. When they arrived at the cell, A man who looked like a gangster appeared. The man said that Stu and the others owed him a pair of kidneys. Pointing at the nearby doctor, the doctor slowly turned around, and in front of everyone, he raised his finger and pointed to another man. He was implying that the man had beaten him up, causing him to lose his kidneys. Without hesitation, Bronco shot the man in the head, then decided to take another pair of kidneys as compensation. This, he claimed, was the correct way to extract kidneys first. Find the right spot under the ribs, then cut open the skin, insert your hand, and pull the kidney out. But Bronco wasn't satisfied with just 2 kidneys. He wanted a third one. The next victim to face the knife was unknown, but when the group didn't respond, Bronco drew his gun. John quickly grabbed a wooden stick, breaking it into pieces. The group decided to draw lots to determine who would be the next donor. When Clem's hand trembled, the second kidney fell to the floor. Bronco instructed Kai to go outside and help pick it up. Along with the man's other organs, the group pulled up their sticks, and John ended up with the shortest one. At this point, the doctor shook his head at Bronco, saying that John was too old and his organs weren't worth anything. John narrowly escaped the ordeal. Among the remaining group, Hugo had the shortest stick. After giving his final instructions, Hugo stripped off his clothes and climbed into the ice bath. Suddenly, Kai spoke up, holding the longest stick but claiming it was the shortest. He pulled Hugo out and climbed into the ice bath himself. John tried to stop his son, but Bronco held a gun to his head. Just then, one of Bronco's men pulled him aside. His sister, Selma, wanted to see him. Kai had just saved himself. Once Bronco left, Clem broke down. She never imagined that her vacation would lead her to being locked up in a prison, let alone being forced to cut open her friend's kidneys as a veterinarian who had never treated animals. Before she could finish complaining, the doctor came over, grabbed her by the hair, and dragged her out of the room. When the group had calmed down, they noticed that Kai had a ring in his hand. During the organ extraction, he had managed to slip the ring off the man's finger. This ring has also become their only wealth. At night, Ryan secretly wakes Stu, and the two go outside. Suspecting that their imprisonment is not just because Greg smuggled contraband alone, someone else must be involved. If Greg were the only one committing the crime, why would the police arrest all of them? So, the two decided they had to find him and uncover the truth. The next day, the two secretly sneaked into Selma's yard. By chance, they ran into Clem, who was taking care of Greg here. Clem led them to his bedside. When they learned their friend was dead, Greg realized they had to leave this place. Ryan asked who his accomplice was, but he didn't answer directly. He only said he had the means to get them out of here. The condition was that he needed a phone to contact the outside world. Meanwhile, John and the others started to worry about food since they were penniless. At that moment, Hugo saw a little girl who was lending money in prison, but when he approached her to borrow $100, the girl told him that since they owed Selma $200,000, no one in the prison would lend them a penny. This meant they would starve to death here. Just then, Kai accidentally saw someone exchange a chicken for money. So, the group went to the old man, and eventually, John exchanged his designer shoes for the chicken the old man had. Meanwhile, Stu and Ryan found the undertaker. He was responsible for handling the bodies of prisoners who died in prison. The two wanted to bury their friend and also wanted a phone to contact the outside world. They only had one ring, and the undertaker agreed to their terms, but they had to choose between the two things. After some discussion, Stu decided to trade the ring for a phone, as getting out of here was their top priority. At this moment, Greg ran out of the yard, and then Stu found him in the bathroom with the phone. Greg contacted his boss, but the boss said that if something went wrong, someone had to take the fall. Thinking about how his wife and children might be implicated, Greg turned his gaze to Stu. After all, Stu only had his mother left to depend on. He wanted Stu to take the blame for him and threatened that if Stu didn't do so, he would tell all his friends the truth. What did Stu hide from his friends? Stu took the phone but didn't comply with Greg's wishes. Instead, he revealed Greg's fault to the boss. Greg tried to snatch the phone back, but he was injured, and during the struggle, Stu pinned him by the cesspit and pressed a cover on his head. However, after finishing the call, Stu realized that Greg had stopped breathing. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. A prisoner was urgently needing to use the bathroom and couldn't hold it any longer. In a panic, Stu threw Greg into the cesspit. As soon as the door opened, the man sat down urgently on the cover. After returning to the cell, Stu quickly hid the phone in a crack in the wall. The chicken that John had exchanged for with his shoes also managed to run outside during this time. When Stu came out of the cell, a chicken's droppings fell from the sky. He looked up and saw the man holding a chicken on the roof. The man said he knew what had happened in the bathroom. Stu went to the man and begged him not to tell anyone about the murder. The man took this opportunity to threaten Stu, asking him for a favor and handing over the chicken. Back in the cell, while everyone was enjoying the delicious chicken, Stu also made a suggestion. There was a factory on this island, and he thought they should work there to earn some money. Otherwise, they would starve to death in prison. The desperate group eventually agreed to his idea. The next day, they arrived early at the factory, but Hugo was missing. He had been invited to Selma's office under the pretense of singing at a banquet, but in reality, she wanted him to kill his brother Branko. She prepared a landmine for Hugo and asked him to place it under Branko's seat when the opportunity arose. As a condition, Hugo asked Selma to help him leave here, and Selma readily agreed, but only for him. Soon after, Selma took him to a villa on the mountain, where he met his friend Clem. It turned out that Selma's boss had heard of a medical genius in the prison and had them bring Clem over to meet her. Taking advantage of the guards' inattention, Hugo told Clem about Selma's plan and asked her to use it to threaten Selma. Perhaps this way, both of them could leave the island. A moment later, Clem was brought to the dining table. The boss was very pleased to meet her, but just as Clem was about to be taken away, she suddenly asked to speak with Selma alone. The two went outside, and Clem threatened Selma to let her go, or she would reveal her plan to the boss. Reluctantly, Selma agreed, but only on the condition that Clem had to complete the liver transplant surgery for the boss first. However, things weren't as simple as they seemed. Meanwhile, in the factory, Stu was helping the man into the ventilation shaft. The man went through the shaft into a secret passage under the factory, where a door led directly to the seaside. However, when the man reached the door, he found a guard's hand on the other side. So, he retraced his steps, but when he reached the end of the hallway, he froze. There was a severed leg in front of him. From a nearby cell, the sound of clanking chains was followed by a beastly growl. Frightened, the man climbed the ladder back into the factory. When no one was paying attention, he ran out the main door. At this time, Stu suddenly felt unwell. He went into the bathroom, sat down on the toilet, and pulled out several contraband items from his backside. Just then, Kai appeared, and Stu quickly flushed the pills down the toilet. When he came out, he found everyone standing in front of him, and to his embarrassment, the toilet had started to overflow, with the filth floating on the toilet. The contraband items also became visible to everyone. Stu's smuggling secret was revealed. Meanwhile, at the villa on the mountain, the banquet had ended, and Selma and her brother were enjoying the usual Easter event. Taking this opportunity, she turned to give Hugo a signal from the house. Hugo took the landmine from his body and placed it under Branko's seat. After pulling out the safety pin, he covered the seat and went to the cart, where he poured himself a drink to calm his nerves. Suddenly, Branko's boyfriend appeared behind him, and Hugo quickly put the bottle down. To his surprise, a listening device fell off the cart. The man was stunned. He was actually an undercover CIA agent sent to collect evidence of the siblings' crimes. As he revealed his identity, he sat down on Branko's seat. Realizing the situation was bad, Hugo tried to leave but was grabbed by the man. The next moment, an explosion rang out. When Branko ran over, he saw the man's body reduced to a mangled half. Meanwhile, Selma sent people to the outside of Stu's cell, where several henchmen fired wildly at the cell, but they didn't know the cell was empty. Hiding on the roof, the man witnessed everything. At that moment, John was violently beating Stu. Fortunately, Ryan rushed over and pulled them apart, but John was still furious. Just as he was about to attack again, he suddenly slipped and fell. He hit the back of his head on the toilet, and Kai immediately ran to his father. Just when everyone thought John was dead, he suddenly opened his eyes, but his mind was no longer clear. At the same time, the man who had been blown up was also Selma's brother Branko's boyfriend. Branko found Hugo's friends and forced them to reveal the truth. It was Selma who took Hugo away, wanting him to sing at the banquet. At that moment, Branko finally understood that his sister Selma wanted his life. When Selma saw that her plan had been exposed, she turned and ran, while Branko, holding a gun, angrily chased after her. The siblings had a fierce battle in the prison. In the chaos, the man saw the guards of the tower climbing down. He sneaked over and, taking advantage of the guard's moment of distraction, knocked him out. Then he climbed the tower, grabbed the intercom, and called the control center. From the guard at the control center, he extracted the escape route, but it required 3 people to go together to reach it. To escape, he came up with a plan to create even more chaos. He told the guard at the control center that Selma and her brother were fighting near the minefield outside and urged the guards to shut it down. At that moment, the guard saw on the surveillance monitors that the prison had descended into chaos, so he hung up the intercom and headed for the power switch. The moment he pulled the switch, he was knocked unconscious by an electric shock. Meanwhile, John, already disoriented, wandered into the minefield, and soon after, a large group of prisoners ran out of the prison. Seeing everyone escaping, Stu and Ryan also ran madly towards the outside. But by this time, the guard at the control center had gotten up from the ground, walked to the desk, and pressed the emergency button, immediately restoring the prison's power. Just as Stu was about to step into the minefield, Ryan suddenly tackled him to the ground. In the distance, explosions rang out in the minefield, and the escaped prisoners immediately stopped, standing still, too afraid to move. John, disoriented, had no idea what was happening. Kai told him to stay still and not move, but John, unable to control himself, took a few steps forward and immediately stepped on a landmine. After the explosion, he was instantly vaporized in front of his son. At that moment, a phone on the ground suddenly rang. In the distance, Stu shouted for someone to throw him the phone. This could be their last chance to escape. Kai grabbed the phone from the ground and threw it hard. On the other side, the man, seeing no hope of escape, begged God for a sign, either let him die here or allow him to leave alive. As soon as he finished speaking, the phone fell into his hand. Then he approached Stu and the others, pulled the phone from his pocket, and used it as leverage to make them follow him. Stu followed him without hesitation. In the distance, Kai kept calling out, asking Ryan to help him, but Ryan, wiping the sweat off his hands, turned and left. Kai, in despair, couldn't accept being trapped here. With gritted teeth, he stepped forward slowly. A bodyguard brought a young man to the doctor, who was preparing to remove his liver for a transplant surgery to be done by Clem. Suddenly, a few firecrackers were thrown into the room, and the explosion made everyone mistakenly think there was gunfire. They immediately released the young man, preparing to fight back, but it turned out to be the young man's sister, who, having learned of her brother's capture, threw firecrackers into the room. The young man tried to escape, but the main door was locked. The doctor tried to stop him but was hit hard on the head by a bottle. The helpless bodyguard drew his gun, and the nearby doctor immediately shot the gun out of his hand because he would not allow the liver to be damaged. The young man quickly picked up the gun from the ground and then grabbed the keys hanging on the wall. Just as he was about to open the door to escape, Selma, the prison manager, walked in. While the two sides were in a standoff, Clem charged from the side and directly injected a tranquilizer into the young man's neck. The young man looked at Clem and immediately collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Clem then kicked the gun on the ground to Selma's feet. To reward Clem, Selma ordered the bodyguard to take her back to the villa and take good care of her. Meanwhile, the young man lying on the floor would be handled by the doctor. As the bodyguard took Clem out of the door, a girl stood in front of them. Before the bodyguard could figure out what was happening, two children suddenly rushed up from behind and stabbed him. The girl slowly walked over and stabbed him several times. Clem quickly ran over and grabbed the bodyguard's hand. Because they couldn't communicate, the girl gave Clem a look, signaling her to leave quickly. Clem took the bodyguard's keys and turned around, just as several children with knives began attacking again. On the other side, the man, along with Stu and the others, tried to escape from the prison during the riot, but on the way, Stu saw a dead man. He immediately recognized this as the mortician who had exchanged his ring for a phone. He and his companion Ryan began searching the man's body and eventually found the ring. They quickly took advantage of the chaos to escape. Meanwhile, Clem returned to the villa with the keys, opened a cell, and freed the woman inside. Gemma had said she could help her escape from the island, but to Clem's surprise, when Gemma walked out the door, she locked Clem inside the cell. Soon after, Selma returned and opened the cell to release Clem, taking her to find the doctor. The doctor was waiting for his transplant surgery, but when they entered, Clem saw the doctor dead in the bathtub. Just as Selma was about to check the situation, Gemma suddenly charged out and attacked her. The two of them began fighting. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Clem picked up the gun on the ground, and both women stopped fighting. At that moment, Gemma turned her attention to the refrigerator, and under Clem's questioning, she revealed the secret hidden inside. It turned out the refrigerator contained a secret passage to an underground tunnel, which led directly to the seaside. After hearing this, Clem pushed both women into the tunnel. Meanwhile, the man led Stu and the others to the factory. where Stu and Ryan strapped the contraband to their bodies. They needed a lot of money to escape. But just then, there was a knock on the door from Bronco. Hearing this, the man quickly ran upstairs, and Stu and Ryan snuck outside the factory. However, just as they were planning how to enter the tunnel, Clem and the others encountered something terrifying in the tunnel. In the pitch-black tunnel, a beast's growl suddenly echoed. Hearing the noise, the group turned and fled. Moments later, Selma, Clem, and Gemma arrived at the control center and broadcasted their location. If her subordinates heard the broadcast and arrived, Clem would never be able to escape the island. At this moment, she came up with a plan to choose one of them to go out as bait. Gemma looked at the surveillance screen and said the guards were getting closer, but just as Clem was distracted, Gemma snatched the gun from her hand and pointed it at Selma. It turned out that Gemma had once been Selma's subordinate. After completing her sentence, she was supposed to leave the island, but Selma deprived her of her freedom and forcibly imprisoned her. So she held a deep grudge against Selma, and the bait had to be Selma. Selma then returned to the tunnel, arrived at a cell door, and yanked it open. Standing in the doorway, she began singing. Before the song stopped, the iron gate behind her suddenly started to close. When she slowly turned around, a giant creature appeared before her. Two female prisoners entered the underground passage of the prison, intending to escape, but they hadn't gotten far before they heard footsteps behind them. They quickly turned around and saw a woman's figure standing before them. They never expected that Selma, who was supposed to be the bait to lure the giant beast away, was still alive. At that moment, Selma saw a corpse nearby. When she flipped the body over, she realized it was her boss. Selma was overcome with despair, as her boss had died on her turf, and those desperate people would never forgive her. Moreover, her brother Bronco was still hunting her down. However, her despair made Gemma act differently and, surprisingly, decided to escape with her. So the three of them reached the end of the tunnel, where there were 3 switches on the wall, and all 3 of them had to pull them together to open the exit above. When Clem's countdown ended, the 3 of them pulled the switches, but what Selma never expected was that her brother Bronco was guarding the tunnel exit. When the siblings locked eyes, Bronco immediately fired 2 shots, and Selma fell to the ground. Bronco then entered the tunnel but did not kill the 2 female prisoners in front of him, because he knew that even if they crawled out of here, they wouldn't be able to escape this small island. After Bronco left, the low growl of a beast echoed through the tunnel. The 2 women quickly climbed up the ladder when they heard the sound, but unexpectedly, Gemma yanked Clem down. However, Clem forcefully pulled her down and quickly climbed up the ladder. At that moment, the gorilla appeared. Clem, who had climbed out of the tunnel, immediately closed the exit lid, watching helplessly as Gemma's blood splattered on the glass, followed by a sharp scream from inside. Meanwhile, the man locked the female supervisor of the factory in a room. The supervisor grabbed a gun from the table and fired a shot at the door lock. However, the shot didn't open the lock but instead hit the man outside the door. On the other side, Stu and his friend Ryan reached the rooftop of the prison. They arrived at the mortician's pit where bodies were disposed of. By jumping into the pit, they could access the underground tunnel. Just as they were about to take the leap, a familiar voice suddenly came from behind. They turned around and saw a hooded figure standing in front of them. When the mysterious person removed the hood, they realized it was Kai. Ryan excitedly tried to hug him, but to his surprise, Kai pulled out a long knife from his waist. It turned out that not only had he survived the landmine explosion, but he also made it out of the minefield unharmed. But as he survived, a seed of hatred had also sprouted in his heart. As his 2 best friends, they had failed to help him when he was dying. So now, seeing them again, he considered them his enemies. He approached Stu and personally pushed him into the pit. Ryan knew Kai wouldn't spare him, so he jumped into the pit as well. However, neither of them died. Only Stu's ribs were broken in 2. Ryan helped him out of the pit. Once they exited the tunnel, they found the man, who was injured. The man told them there was a gorilla in the tunnel. A gorilla that not only ate fruit but also liked to eat people. Luckily, the man had been locked in a cell with the gorilla and became best friends with it using a box of bananas. Now that the man knew he couldn't survive here, he gave them a box of contraband and an airboat. Also returning Stu's phone, he told them there were 3 switches on the wall at the tunnel's end. Pulling them would open the escape route outside. Just as he finished speaking, the low growl of the gorilla echoed in the tunnel. The man hurriedly motioned for them to kneel and stay silent, then hummed a familiar tune to the gorilla. After a moment, the gorilla appeared before them, and as the man had said, the giant beast truly considered him a friend. Seeing him injured, it reached out its hand to comfort him. Stu and Ryan took the opportunity to quietly leave. Following the man's instructions, they reached the end of the tunnel and found the 3 switches on the wall. However, no matter which switch Ryan pulled, nothing happened. Then Stu saw Gemma's body lying there. Ryan realized that all 3 switches had to be pulled at the same time to open the exit. With Stu's help, they lifted Gemma's body and tied her hands to the switches using cloth strips. Then, Ryan used one hand to grab the switches and placed his foot on Gemma. As he counted to 3, he released his foot and pulled the switches together. Immediately, the exit above opened, and they successfully climbed out. Soon after, the man, dragging his injured body, reached the bottom of the exit. He wanted to let the gorilla out too. The gorilla seemed to understand his words and, after a couple of gestures, immediately climbed up the ladder. Just then, Bronco suddenly appeared. The leader in the prison was about to execute a criminal who was trying to escape when suddenly a gorilla jumped out from behind him. Before he could react, the beast knocked him to the ground. The gorilla slowly approached him. In an angry roar, the gorilla raised both hands, and Bronco was smashed into a bloody pulp under the pain-filled scream. On the other side, Stu and Ryan had reached the seaside, but they faced a new problem. Stu thought that the airboat they had could only hold one person, so escaping the island seemed impossible, but Ryan wanted to give it a try. What if it worked? At that moment, Stu called Ryan over and asked him to close his eyes and reminisce about their good times together. Perhaps this was their last moment, but Ryan could never have imagined that when he opened his eyes, Stu was standing in front of him with a rock, and without hesitation, he smashed it into Ryan's head. Then, Stu opened the airboat, and it turned out that it could fit both of them. He regretted acting too soon, but by then, Ryan had already fallen to the ground, unresponsive. In the end, Stu threw the contraband onto the boat and dragged it into the sea. However, just as he was enjoying his freedom, Clem suddenly jumped out of the water and climbed onto the boat. Stu saw the gun on the boat. He couldn't let Clem leave alive, or she would report his crimes to the world. Clem seemed to see through his intentions, and the two of them lunged for the gun at the same time. But after the gunshot, Ryan suddenly opened his eyes. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.